Hi, everyone. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. And along with my colleague, Carolyn Dean, we want to welcome you here today. It's an especially, great honor to introduce today's speaker, Philip Nord. He's the Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at Princeton, where he's taught since 1981. One of the leading historians of late 19th and 20th century France, he's devoted his career to exploring the working of ideologies like anti-Semitism and republicanism and how they shape cultural forms. His books include Parish Shopkeepers and the Politics of Resentment, 1986, The Republican Moment, Struggles for Democracy in 19th Century France, 1995, Impressionists and Politics, Art and Democracy in the 19th Century, 2000, France's New Deal from the 30s to the post-war era, 2010, and his new book, which we'll be talking about today, After the Deportation, Memory Battles in Post-War France, which was just published by Cambridge University Press and is the subject of a roundtable on H. Diplo that Carolyn edited. And I'll just say that this book is stunning in both its breadth and its depth. As I said in my review for that roundtable, it's going to be the definitive history of the way that World War II was remembered in France. Phil Nord is a Guggenheim Fellow, a former director of the Shelby Cullom Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, and the recipient of many awards and honors. He also happens to be a fellow Chicagoan. So now let me just say a word about how things will work today. First, Phil will present the book, then Carolyn is going to say a few words about it, then we'll open it up to your questions, and we'll finish promptly at 6 p.m. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask them to Phil. Please don't raise your hand since we won't see you. You're welcome to start submitting questions at any time, including during the lecture itself. And now I will hand it over to Professor Philip Nord.
Thank you, Maury. Greetings to the audience whom I can't see, but I'm hopeful, if not confident, that you're out there. Let me express also begin by expressing some words of thanks to Maurice Samuels and Carolyn Dean for organizing this event, and also a word also for Alice Kaplan, who was supposed to participate but has been ill, and so I'd like to wish her well. So let me begin with a few introductory remarks before we turn to the discussion. About 160,000 French people were deported from France during World War II to Nazi camps in Central and Eastern Europe. 76,000 of these deportees were Jews, and for Jews, deportation in effect meant a sentence of death. Very few returned, a couple thousand, a little bit more, but almost everybody who was deported was murdered. For the others, many of these were résistants, were resistance fighters, and their chances of dying were high as well, a little under 50%. So they're two very different experiences as these mortality rates attest of what the deportation experience was like. And yet in French, both experiences are subsumed under a common term, la déportation, the deportation. Immediately at the end of the war, stories started to be told about this experience. They were told in a variety of formats, through a variety of means and vehicles, books, poetry, movies, artwork, monuments, memorials of all kinds. This right from the very start. And the people who told these stories, fashioned them, came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were survivors, some were relatives of survivors, some were artists who thought the experience urgent enough that they felt they had to deal with it in one way or another. And I discussed a number of these in my books, and I'll cite you a list. It's longer than that, but of some of the principal ones: Robert Antelme, Pablo Picasso, Alain René, Jean Quérol, David Rousset, Edgar Morin, Charlotte Delbo, Jorge Semprún, Edmond Michelet, Elie Wiesel, Andre Schwarzbart, Claude Lanzmann, and others as well, whom I'll mention in my remarks as we go along. So many media, many people, it's an enormous outpouring. I wind down my analysis of this corpus of work sometime in the mid 1990s, but it continues on down to the present days, and I'm still reading it, and I suspect I will be reading it for many years to come. These stories are patterned by political and religious commitments. The communists, who were among the first to get into the storytelling practice or game, I don't want to use that word, get into the practice of storytelling, told a story of anti-fascist struggle. The non-communist left also entered the fray not long thereafter, and for them the concentrationary form was not the appanage of the fascist world alone, but of totalitarians in general. Stalinists as well as Hitlerians had concentration camps. For others, the concentration reform was something that was imminent in modern life itself, and you found it everywhere, not just in Hitler's Germany or in Stalin's Soviet Union, but you found it even in France itself. France maintaining internment concentration camps during the Algerian War. The Gauls also had a word to say about camps and deportation, but they saw it through the lens of an ongoing struggle against hereditary foe, Germany, and discussed this experience in the framework of what they called the 30 Years' War. Now, as for religious commitments, Roman Catholic deportees talked about their experience as a fight of the spirit against the Nazi neo-paganism, and Jews too had something to say about the deportation experience, really right from the very beginning. It was seen in a variety of lights in these first post-war decades as part of a millennial-long experience of persecution that dated back to biblical times. And from this perspective, those who were murdered in the deportation, murdered in the camps, had died as martyrs in sanctification of the name, Kiddush Hashem. But others stressed Jewish resistance in the face of Nazi persecution, citing the case of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but not just that. There were also Sonderkommando revolts in various death camps at Helmno, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and these too were celebrated. And these Jewish dead were understood to be not just martyrs, but also heroes. So there is an ebb and flow to the stories told about the deportation, a variety of themes and narratives interweaving. Try to make 4 points about this ebb and flow. One is it's inflected by events, the major events of the era, the Cold War, of course, the Algerian War, which I've already mentioned. But also the war of 1967, the Arab-Israeli War, the negationist crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. And I should add as well, de Gaulle's return to power in 1958. But Jews were always a part of the story. It used to be received wisdom that there was a long silence. And of course, in many homes and many families, that's true, but I'm talking about a public silence. It used to be thought that there was a public silence, and the silence and the Jewish experience and Jewish suffering was not discussed. And I try to push back against this a little bit, acknowledging that in the first war decades, that while there was a Jewish voice, there were many, many other voices that were much louder and occupied more space in the public domain. All these voices, not quite a cacophony, but sometimes they contended with each other competed with each other and fought against each other. And the communist Gaullist struggle over deportation memory is perhaps the most well-known. And that's why I put memory battles in the title of my book, because while there's cooperation, there is also contention. Now, the Jewish voice would grow stronger in the 1970s and 1980s, and eventually become, by the 1990s, the dominant one. And as a result, historians talk about a reversal of memory. And as I see it, it's not just that the Jewish voice becomes dominant, but also the tonality of the Jewish story itself begins to change, with the focus less on heroism and on martyrdom, and more on the experience of loss. The emphasis is no longer on sacrifice, more on loss, and sometimes also on victimization. All of this, of course, begs the question as to why such a reversal of memories took place. The answer to this, and others have addressed it, the question, my answer is a little different. Often the practice is to emphasize very particular events. The Eichmann trial of 1961, which is supposed to have turned a light on in public consciousness, or the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, forgive me. And I do treat these events, but I interpret them less as turning points than as accelerators, pushing a process forward that had its origins in elsewhere, with other kinds of explanations. And I insist on two vectors of change in particular. The first, once again, not unique to me, but I put a lot of weight on it, is on Catholic-Jewish dialogue, Christian-Jewish dialogue, Catholic in particular. So Catholics play a prominent role in my story of two kinds. One is brokers or intermediaries, as passeurs, who helped bring the Jewish story to public attention. And here I would cite the case of Jacques Maritain, who's a very good friend of Marc Chagall's, collected some of Chagall's work, or François Mauriac, who provided the introduction to Elie Wiesel's La Nuit, when it was published in French in 1958, and also a lesser known figure, a man named Paul Flamand, who was the editor at Le Seuil. But Le Seuil was the publishing house that first published André Schwarz-Bach's Le Dernier des Justes, The Last of the Just, in 1959, which was a Prix Goncourt winning, a very prestigious prize. Flamand published Elie Wiesel after La Nuit, and he was also the publisher of some of Saul Friedlander's first works, and some of you in the audience will know Saul Friedlander's spectacular work on the Holocaust, a recent two-volume study. But it wasn't all about dialogue. There was also a lot of contention between Christians and Jews, between Catholics and Jews over memory, and this too roiled the public domain. In this connection, I would cite three things. First of all, the work of Jules Isaac, some of you may know it, wrote a groundbreaking and hefty text, which was published in the late 40s, Jésus et Israël. And in it, he excoriates the church for what he calls the teaching of contempt, the teaching of anti-Semitism across millennia, a teaching that in Isaac's polemic greased the wheels that led trainloads of Jews to Auschwitz. Not just Isaac, there's also the Finley affair, which erupted in public life in 1952 and 1953. I don't want to rehearse it in detail, but two Jewish boys have been placed for safekeeping during the war by their parents with a Catholic religious order. The parents were deported and murdered. The children survived, looked after by this religious order who farmed them out to a nurse. And after the war, an aunt came looking for them, and the caretaker had the children baptized, and the church did not want to let go of the children, in effect kidnapping them. And there was a major, major public uproar that was not just national, but international at the same time. Very contentious. In the end, the boys were released to their aunt and the family. The remnants of the Finoli family moved to Israel. I treat this as a scene setter for the Catholic Church's Vatican II reflections on its teaching on the Jews. And at Vatican II, a papal declaration follows called Nostra Aetate in our times, which represents a beginning of rethinking church doctrine on Jewish life. But the Catholic-Jewish dialogue plays a major role in my discussion. And so too does 1968. Now I understand 1968 not just as the events of May of that year in France, but as a longer phenomenon, what historians call the long 68, begins somewhere in the mid-1960s and stretches on into the beginning of the Mitterrand presidency in the early 1980s. And to me, 68 understood in this way is meaningful in my story in three ways. First of all, a number of the principals were 68ers. Marcel Fools was active in a strike at public television in 1968, and some of you will know who Marcel Fools was. It made a couple of quite spectacular movies having to do with the wartime experience, The Sorrow and the Pity, Le Chagrin et la Pitié, which he completed in '69 and showed not on TV, but in movie theaters in 1971. Later, in 1976, another movie called The Movement, Memory of Justice, which deals not just with the war, but also with France's Algerian War and with the American War in Vietnam, pushing them all together and inviting people to reflect about the connections between these kinds of experiences. Or I could mention Beata Klarsfeld. Once again, some of you will know who the Klarsfelds were, Beata and Serge, and she was involved in strikes in 1968 in France. So there were 68ers involved in the story, and as O Fool's movies demonstrate, what they were doing with their artwork was in part, how should I put it, busting myths about World War II, particularly Gaullist and communist ones, and in effect debunking received wisdom on what the war had been all about. In effect, clearing the memory decks so that other kinds of stories, not communist, not Gauls, but other kinds of stories, Jewish in particular, could surge into the public consciousness. And a third way in which 68 played a role has to do with techniques. And here Beata Klarsfeld is a good case in point, Beata and Serge both, who did scholarly work, but also who were past masters at publicizing events, orchestrating courtroom dramas, taking part in demonstrations, sit-ins, all to force on the public a consciousness of what had happened to the Jews during the Second World War. Now, the last substantive chapter of my book deals with Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and I wind up there for a variety of reasons. I suppose one of them is that it's a monumental work, and monuments figure very prominently in most of the chapters of my book. There is a communist corner at Père Lachaise Cemetery in northeastern Paris, where there is a whole host of concentration camp memorials. I should also mention the Mémorial aux Martyrs de la Déportation on the Ile de la Cité, and some of you will have visited. It's located just behind Notre Dame. Maybe not easy of access these days. There is a concentration camp memorial in France itself, at Struthof in Alsace. The Mémorial de la Shoah, as it's now known, in the Marais, which is a Jewish memorial, when it was first opened in 1956. It was known by another name as the Tombeau du Martyr Juif Inconnu, the Tomb of the Unknown Jewish Martyr, changed its name to the Memorial of the Unknown Jewish Martyr, today the Memorial de la Shoah. So I discuss memorials throughout, monuments throughout, and Lanzmann's work is monumental at over 9 hours in length. Also, it gives a new name to the experience of Jewish deportation. In France, the Holocaust is used, but not as currently as the word Shoah. It's a strange word from the Hebrew, not well known, but it catches something, and this is the third reason why I end up, of the singularity and unprecedented nature of the Holocaust, unprecedented in its scales and its means, and in its means of execution. And Lanzmann's movie exemplifies as well this new understanding of what the Shoah was, not a story of heroism or even of martyrs, but a story of unredeemed loss. And in this connection, the figures in the movie who stand out for me, and I suspect for others as well, are the Sonderkommandos, those who were charged with disposing of the bodies of the murdered. People like Philippe Müller and Abraham Bamba, who both figure prominently as interviewees in Lanzmann's movie, and they were Sonderkommandos who had literally entered into the gas chambers and come out again alive and could tell about as much as any living human being could about what that experience was. And then, of course, the figure of Simon Schrebnik, who was a Sonderkommando at Helmno, charged with burning bodies. And it's with him that Lanzmann opens the movie and closes the movie. Now, I conclude, I have a conclusion, epilogue and a conclusion, with some reflections about why this outpouring, and an outpouring so inventive in its nature, happened in France, why there, and not say in Israel or the United States. Not that it was ignored in Israel and the United States, but it is unusually creative in the French context. And I propose three kinds of explanations for that. First one is if I were to hesitate to use is demographic, but it's a way of saying that one, there were a lot of Jews in France after the war. The Jewish community is about 250,000 strong. Yes, 79,000 Jews total were murdered of the French Jewish community, but 3/4 of the community survived in hiding or in exile, and then they return after the war. So there was a Jewish population that had an experience of persecution in France itself, numerous and willing to speak. In addition to that, there were all the resistants deportees who came back, tens of thousands of them, with stories of their own to tell. So there was a community varied in nature that had an interest in wanting to talk about the deportation experience. Not just that, there are political reasons why this mattered so much in France. France had suffered defeat in 1940 and occupation thereafter, experiences of humiliation, and there were resistants, but also deportees whose sacrifice could be understood as something redemptive. So that the story of the war was not just a story of humiliation, defeat, but a horror story of resistance and redemptive sacrifice at the same time. And the question is, who would own this particular memory? It came freighted with a lot of moral authority, and many, many currents of opinion wanted to control it, and there was contention over that control. And last of all, and my interlocutors are all experts on this, greater experts than I am, and it would be true if we added Alice Kaplan into the group. The post-war decades in France are periods of exceptional creativity, and deportation literature intersects with these currents of creativity, with surrealism and existentialism, with modernist architecture, with new wave cinema, with the new novel. with Oulipo, which is the Ouvreur de littérature potentielle. I don't know how to translate that, but in any case, it's a literary movement that Georges Perec belonged to, and he writes about the deportation in W, Le Souvenir d'Enfance. And when it comes to movies, the intersection between cutting edge cinema and the deportation is complete. And I just mentioned once again, Renee and Queiroz movie, Night and Fog, but not just that, Marcelo Foul's Sorrow and Opinions, Lanzmann's Shoah, and there are more, Edgar Morin, Jean Rouch, Chronique d'un été, which is 1961, and a lesser known movie called Le Temps de Ghetto from 1961 also. These are all very creative, imaginative works. So it's my hope that people who read the book, even if they don't agree with anything I have to say, will at least find it worthwhile to visit or revisit the works that I discuss in the book, the monuments, the artwork, the novels. Because it is a creative corpus and quite wonderful, that deserves the widest possible public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil, for that really great summary of the book. So now we'll have a few words from Carolyn, and then we will open it up to questions. So everyone in the audience, please start sending questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Professor Philip Nord. Thank you, Maury. I just wanted to take a few minutes to clarify the importance of Philip Nord's new book, partly because as he says, he pushed back a little bit on a certain assumption about the fact that Jews in France during the immediate post-war period until 1968 were silent. Now, he doesn't just push back on this idea a little bit, he actually our understanding of deportation in France. In fact, this book is, and I say this with no exaggeration, the most important discussion and history of deportation from Vichy France of Jews and communist political dissidents of the past 30 years. The first important discussion, which really set the stage, was Henri Rousseau's book, which was called The Vichy Syndrome, which suggested that there was this silence and it had been, and noise, though there was discussion among Jews, the noise began only about the Jewish deportation and specificity only in 1968. Before I sort of discuss this, say this just a little more in more detail in a minute, I just want to note for the audience, those of you who may or may not know this, and perhaps Phil would like to comment on this after in the Q&A session, that the majority of Jews deported from France during this period were in fact foreign Jews who had fled Nazi and Austria since Hitler took power in 1933, excuse me, and of course annexed Austria in 1938. And they were also those Jews who had been naturalized French, especially since 1927. It was a very important naturalization law, and many Jews from Eastern Europe who had lived in France had been naturalized. And the French government under the Vichy regime undertook a denaturalization process of many of these Jews, not all of them, who were stripped of their citizenship and then were allowed to be interned. By definition, they were all enemies of the state, and they were interned in internment in France. So I thought that was just an interesting fact that would be important to mention, because the majority of French Jews, not all of them, of course, did survive. And that is a question that has raised a lot of, that has provoked a lot of discussion and debate. And Phil wanted to speak to that just because it's an interesting fact about France. Now, let me just reiterate some things Phil said very quickly. After 1945, the French imagined deportees as anti-fascist patriotic victims of the Nazi regime that are usually cited for this period and communist accounts of French heroic martyrdom, focused on resistance fighters, reflected Jewish suffering. That is the usual narrative about this period. It goes on to say immediately after the war, the French rarely made distinctions between death camps and concentration camps, or imagined them to be different versions of Nazi torture and persecution. Some people died in death camps and some people in concentration camps. Jews, as Phil has noted, were supposedly silent, meaning that they spoke to each other their experiences, but their voices were otherwise inaudible. So it was only this narrative goes after 1968 and the student rebellion, when this younger generation questioned French complicity and also criticized French colonialism. And these rebels, Rousseau have argued, unearthed long repressed memories about Jewish persecution and the Vichy regime that had until then been buried. Now, the importance of Phil's book, it's really paradigm shattering, or my characterization of it and many others as paradigm shattering, is because it tells an entirely different story that is not just pushing back a little bit. Other historians, of course, have suggested that Jewish voices have not been entirely silent, but this book makes a much more ambitious claim that Jews were far more central to post-war discussions than has been imagined. And in arenas, some of the ones that Phil mentioned, camp and war memorials, novels, films, Catholic Jewish dialogue, surprisingly, that we had not thought to explore previously. Now, he's discussed some of this for us today and given us much food for thought. So I hope we can follow up with and ask him more about this important book in the time remaining. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Great, Phil. So I don't know if you had something, if you wanted to react before we dive into the question. I wanted to react to Carolyn or add anything.
Yeah, so just a few quick reactions. I want to give the audience a chance to jump in. Carolyn invited me to say something about why France has such a substantial Jewish community after the war. It's now, those of you who follow closely the New York Review of Books can see the back and forth between Robert Paxson and Jacques Sumelin over just this issue. Many Jews survive in France, and it's foreign Jews in particular who were deported, but still a large number of foreign Jews who've taken refuge in France in the interwar decades, they too survive as well. And in fact, it's they even more than the native born who will be active in the Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine, which is one of the first organizations that pushes Jewish memory in the 1950s, when there was supposedly silent. The reasons for Jewish survival, some of it has to do with geography. There are mountains. It helps to have mountains, the Alps. It helps to have remote countryside as well. So, which is why Jews' survival is much less in small countries like Belgium or the Netherlands, for that matter. It also makes a difference how hard the Nazis tried and whether they had the forces on hand to execute their policy. And in the East, they tried hard and they had the Wehrmacht to help out. And this does not come to pass in France to the same way. And so the level of murderousness is not the same. But I don't want to gainsay what Semelin, the argument that he makes, which is that there were many people to help Jews themselves, and particular native born who had resources and language skills and could protect their countrymen, fellow Jews, but also non-Jewish French people peasants in particular who welcomed hid Jews in their homes, but also religious institutions like Protestant churches. And some of you will have heard of Chambon-sur-Lignon, which is a Protestant town, which was in effect a village refuge, a place where Jews could go hide in fairly significant numbers, but the Catholic Church as well organized networks of rescue. And if I've mentioned Saul Friedlander, and he was protected. An enfant caché is called a hidden child in a Catholic school. And there are many other instances of that. I could go on, but I probably shouldn't. Yeah, maybe I undersold my book, Carolyn, a little bit. Okay, I appreciate your doing that. And then last of all, there is the issue of repressed memory, and that's a tricky one. And I'm not sure that I negotiated it. Once again, false modesty on my part. I negotiated it fully successfully because there is the puzzle that if there's a lot going on, why do people talk about repressed memory? And with conviction. And I guess I'd say a number of things to that. One is that when it comes to internal life of families and individuals, there's plenty of repressed memory. And so it's just in the public domain where there are narratives being enunciated. That's where there's not the silence. And maybe these public stories aren't satisfying to individual people, and they don't see themselves in these public stories in one way or another. But also, I try to suggest that some of the earlier stories emphasize religion, heroism, martyrdom, and that for younger people, they're not interested in this kind of thing. And these are not stories that resonate with them in any particular way. And in addition, with France in the mid-1960s, de Gaulle is back in power, and he is putting the full weight of the state behind a certain kind of memory politics. And for people who grow up in the midst of that in the 60s, it might seem as though nothing else existed but the Gaulle story, and maybe some communist story too, if you grew up in a leftist household. And so, at that conjuncture, in that world, it might have seemed that there was silence because other stories were being blared so loudly in nature. And then, last of all, the return of the repressed paradigm is one that begins to circulate in the 60s and 70s, and it's one that's embraced by young people. That's why we didn't know about it. It was repression. This is how psyche works. This is how national psyches work at the same time. And so that's the kind of explanatory framework that I explore.
Okay, so the Q&A is blowing up, as they say. Right. So we have a lot of questions. So one question from an audience member is whether it just takes time for emotions to pass, to allow for a more objective, non-apologetic writing. So do you discuss that aspect of things? Like maybe people, it's not just politics and changing politics, but also just the fact that people, couldn't talk. It took them a while to be able to talk after the war.
Yes, and there's truth in that. And I think immediately both Wiesel sketched pieces of what would become La Nuit early, and then put it aside. And Jorge Semprún did the same thing, and Charlotte Delbo did the same thing. So there absolutely is truth to that. The only thing I would say is, while that's also true, right away after the war ends, deportees begin to appear in their camp stripes, in fact, at public events. And so there was a May Day in 1945. Communist deportees are there. They parade in their stripes down the Champs-Élysées, in effect. And the communists, before the 1940s are out, are beginning to build memorials in Père Lachaise Cemetery, which are gathering places. So it may be hard for some people to talk about individually, but when it comes to collective memory actions, of the kind the communists undertook. And then de Gaulle pushes back right away. He retires from public life in 1946 and goes quiet for a little period. But then people want to push back against the communists. You don't own the deportation story. There are other stories that are told here too. And of course, there are those like Isaac Schneerson, who's the man behind the CDG, this, and his view is, I do not want the people who were murdered to die without recognition of some kind or another, and I am going to see that a monument is built to them. And he starts during the war, in effect. I mean, he's a very determined figure. And the Memorial de la Shoah, the first stone is laid in 1953. And the building is completed in 1956, a very, very early memorialization. But so, yes, it does require, I do want to acknowledge that, particularly where individual memory is concerned. And some of the people I talk about have that kind of delay. But in other instances, there is no delay at all. And they begin laying down their markers, literally, and fighting over this. And right from 44, 45.
So I'm going to jump to a question because you mentioned the memorial on the Ile de la Cité. And someone asked a question about that and about the controversy about whether it sufficiently focuses on the Jewishness of victims. So could you say a little bit more about that monument and the story you're telling?
So it's a quite wonderful monument. Insufficient mention of the Jews, there is none. Okay, I mean, it is elided completely. But it's also worth noting who got the monument built. And it's three people in particular: Father Michel Riquet, who's a Jesuit father, a deportee, was deported to Dachau for resistance activities, and a philo-Semite, but that's may not be relevant. A man named Paul Origi, also a practicing Roman Catholic, and Edmond Michelet, also a practicing Roman Catholic. And the architect that they got on board to launch this was among other things, he was a modernist architect, but also a church architect. So that I treat this monument as having a religious inspiration behind it initially. And as they tried to get the okay to build this monument from various public authorities, the public authorities tell them this is okay, but it should be to the deportation in general and not single anybody out. So no class, no politics, no race, no religion. That's what they're told to do. And so they try to do a big tent memorial with a spiritual quality to it. And I think in its minimalism, it has a certain kind of spirituality. Janet Flanner, who was the New Yorker's woman in Paris, described it as like a wayside shrine. And it cites texts that cover the full range. There are written texts that are in the crypt of this memorial. The full range of resistance experience, from Father Madieu all the way to Jean-Paul Sartre, and Louis Aragon, I think also, who's a communist, is also there. And it takes, to build the concrete, it takes rock from all the mountain ranges of France. And so it's meant to be this kind of encompassing, non-denominational, but spiritual monument. And the deal is, no, the Jews get no mention at all in this particular story. Although, as I said, Father Riquet himself is not an anti-Semite, but on the contrary, took risks to save Jews during the war and was deported.
Great. Yeah, that's such an interesting monument, and we could talk more about its placement, but I want to go to some of the other questions. So one from someone who I'm sure you know, Susan Suleiman, who writes that some historians and other scholars would choose the Klaus Barbie trial, which occurred a couple of years after Lanzmann's Shoah, as the culminating moment of the story you're trying to tell, the memory of the deportation, especially since it led to a whole slew of new memoirs by Jewish deportees, as well as members of the resistance. So could you say a little bit more about how you decided to kind of end your story with Shoah?
Yeah, it's interesting. how should I put it? I don't say I downplay the trials. There's a whole slew of them that take place, and they begin in Cologne of Nazi officials who had been part of the police apparatus in occupied France, and then the series of French. And in fact, that was the interest for me is the French people who participated in the deportation experience, like Paul Touvier or Papon, Maurice Papon, for that matter, and the way in which this obliged the French not just to think the Germans did bad things to us, which is easy and which they know, but that we did bad things ourselves. It was Vichy that participated in this, and part of the interest for me in that is that it then draws attention not to German spaces, but to spaces in France of Jewish suffering, and that means places like Drancy, the transit camp in Paris suburbs, or Isieux, a children's home not far from the French Alps, from which Jewish children were deported because of Barbie, who was the Lyon Gestapo chief. But so Barbie does figure, and he figures in a couple ways in the story. One, because the Klarsfelds go after him, and they track him down to Bolivia and make a fuss over him, and bring him to the public attention. And also Barbie, because of the Isieux story, which is one that's particularly touching because it involves Jewish children who were murdered. So it's part of the story. I do end with Landsmann in part because of the narrative power of this particular work, and the darkness that it sheds. Oh, and on the matter of time, I was thinking, because I'm sorry to revert to an earlier question, because I think one of the things, not just it takes time to tell the story, but stories build up over time, so that what is the Holocaust, of course, is not known in 1944, 1945. And it requires really decades of work that is both scholarly and testimonial in nature for the various aspects and dimensions of this thing, of this monstrosity, to start to come into focus for people. So in that sense, this is also, this is another temporal dimension to the story I have to tell.
So we have so many great questions here, and I'm going to apologize for not being able to ask all of them, and I'm just going to skip to some things that we haven't touched on, but I think are really important. So there's a question from Sam Moyne, from our colleague, about what's at stake in focusing on French, writing French across the genres, versus, for instance, some of the early writing in Yiddish and speaking in Yiddish about the deportation?
So two things. One is I don't do the Yiddish, so that is an obstacle. I got help translating Elie Wiesel's Night when it first was published in Yiddish, and I was interested in the translation from French into Yiddish. But second of all, and so this isn't just, I don't have the skills. It's also, I want it in the domain of French public life. And Yiddish is not the linguistic means by which that will happen. It has to happen in French. And so that's why the focus is on the French language corpus. It's not that I'm not interested. It's a quite wonderful book by a young man named Simon Perregaux, whom you, I don't know if you all know him, but I know Carolyn knows him, which is about the Parisian Jewish world, largely or significantly Yiddish speaking, and the way in which the experience and memorialization and mourning of loss is present in a very powerful way, almost in a constitutive way, after World War II. So if you're interested in that, there it is, and he does it beautifully. But I wanted, when the world beyond the borders of the Jewish community is made to pay attention or is led to pay attention. And so I think the medium for that to happen is in the French language itself.
So here's a question from Ron Levy about how the memory of the deportation intersects with other memories, for instance, of Algeria and the Algerian War.
So that's a great question. So this is Michael Rothberg has written extensively and inventively, imaginatively about this. What I would have to add to it is that some of it depends on what your politics are. And so for the non-communist left, the experience of the Algerian War is a wake-up call. They are galvanized by this. Ex-deportees, I mean, someone like Charlotte Delbo is a good case in point. She was once a party member. She leaves the party. She's ferociously anti-colonial, and she sees it through the experience, through the lens of her own deportation experience to Auschwitz, and it fuels her passion. Now, there are other people like Germaine Tillon, who has been pantheonized, for whom the Algerian War is also a crushing experience. And she wants to find a solution to it. And she sees the war and torture through the lens of her own experience, but she doesn't come out for an independent Algeria at the far end. So in both cases, the war plays an important role in mobilizing them, and their war experience shapes how they're mobilized. But they come out at slightly different places. Just because you intersect doesn't mean that you're going to come out with the same view of the Algerian War. Some of that depends on your politics. And Delbo is a non-communist leftist, very left-wing, and Germaine Tillon is a Gaullist. And so they come out both shaped by the Algerian War and the connection or intersectionality, that's not the word, multi-directionality, that's his word, between these two experiences, but they come out at different places because they enter them politically differently.
Great. So here's a question from my colleague in the French department, Howard Block. If you could say more about the public places of memory, not the great ones, but those small signs on lycée and in public gardens. And especially, I've noticed also that they've changed in recent years. And now, well, anyway, I'll let you.
No, actually, I would be interested in how they've changed.
I mean, I've noticed that on schools, for instance, they're much more, it seems like it's a change, that they're much more willing to say that it was Jewish children, to mention the Jewishness of the children who were deported. Whereas I feel like when I used to go to France, like in the first times in the 80s, I don't remember that, but I could be wrong. So
no, I don't, of course, it's one of those things when you start looking and paying attention. So my experience is like yours, Maury. No, I think in response to the question, it's a critique that is say I don't do it. I look at the haut lieu as the high places. Now, what could I say? I could have an impression, which is one that these local memorials are a more recent phenomenon, but I don't know that for a fact. It's what I suspect, but I don't know because I didn't study it. The mentioning of Jews, a good case is Isieux. It's not a local, well, it is local. It's now a major national memorial too. It had right away, this is the Jewish home in the, not far from the French Alps, a Jewish home for children. And it had a memorial early on, but it said nothing about who the children were. Now they did have a Magen David on it, but no mention. No precision after that. And this changes in the 1990s completely. And it's identified both the home itself and the plaque that's on the home and the monument, which is located some distance away, where they talk about who the killers were, who the people who saved children, and who the children were who died, that they were Jewish children. And so I think that, and a good, in fact, I'll give you another good, it's not exactly a local, I'm sorry, I'm dodging the question, but this is more in line with what you said, Maurice. There's an Auschwitz memorial at Père Lachaise Cemetery. It was erected by communists. In 1995, the plaque that you see is added there that identifies the people who died at Auschwitz as being principally Jews. That's only added in the mid-1990s. So I have a feeling that this sort of local story, and a local story where Jews are identified by name, is last 30 years story, a little bit after, or where I wind down.
So here's a really interesting question about the role of the organized Jewish community in France in controlling memory. So like the consistoire, did they try to limit the importance of the Jewish component of the deportation out of fear that it would arouse anti-Semitism or that they'd be accused of communautarisme and things like that?
It's an interesting, I'll tell you what I have on that, which is the consistoire early puts up a plaque in the Rue de la Victoire synagogue. It's in the peristyle there, which talks about all who were lost, but it's actually very reticent about identifying the people who died as Jews. Now it's but it's in the synagogue at the same time, so it's a little bit hidden away. And when Isaac Schneerson and the Centre de Documentation Juive Contemporaine wants to build a monument, the consistoire is reluctant, and Schneerson has to go it alone. He's very creative, very dynamic. So there's some reticence about that, but not completely, because the consistoire does get ashes or soil from concentration camps and distributes them around France for memorial purposes. It has Yizkor services, it has memorial services. So while they're low key and not insistent, they're not in denial. And it's an interesting phenomenon. France has something called the Journée Nationale de la Déportation every April, a deportation Memorial Day. And there's an itinerary, various stops along the way. It was a very smallish affair when it began in 1954, but by 1955-56, the Rue de la Victoire synagogue figured as part of this, as well as Notre Dame, as well as Schneerson's memorial, as well as a number of other memorials as well. And so even at this early stage, in the mid-50s you have the Jewish story with the consistoire included, part of the general itinerary for memorialization of the deportation.
So we're almost out of time, but there are two other questions I want to make sure to get to. So one is, and this is a big question, but so try to answer it, quickly if you can. But what role the large immigration of North African Jews plays in your story? So the fact that hundreds of thousands of Jews come because of decolonization and are now the biggest segment of the French Jewish population.
I don't know if you remember our exchange, Carolyn and Maury. I got taken to task for these things and that one too, and so I have a feeling we've got another sharp audience on our hands here. I really focus, and it's a blind spot. I fear it is. I mean, I focus on the Ashkenazi community into the 1960s and the way in which it's very much transformed by the arrival of North African Jews there. Doesn't figure in my story, and maybe it should, and that it's something that I've missed, and it inflects the story or shapes it or rewrites it in surprising way. I need to be persuaded, is the way I would put it. I don't want to be skeptical, but it may be more like I should be careful what I say. The way in which the Civil War in the United States is part of my memory. But I wasn't here, nor were any of my ancestors when it happened. And I wondered if it's not the same thing for Sephardi Jew. Of course, there are some. I mean, one of Schneerson's right-hand man is Vidal Modiano, and I write about Modiano's, not Vidal, but the novelist Modiano's work, and they have Sephardi background as well. But they're part of the story, and I don't know that they have bring a distinctive something.
I wonder if you could argue that they liberated a certain way of being Jewish in France, and that enabled the Ashkenazis to be more.
No, I don't see that I don't buy, because the Ashkenazi Schneerson, he doesn't need anyone to liberate.
Doesn't need any liberation.
He's a feisty character, and ready to put up his dukes. Or even Jules Isaac is a good case in point. Now, he's a classic native-born Jew who's not particularly interested in his Judaism, but an educator interested in Republican schooling. But the experience of the war, where he has to go into hiding, where one of his children is in the resistance, his wife and daughter are deported and murdered, another kid is deported and comes back, and he is full of polemic and he is not holding back at all, and he doesn't need an influx of anybody to help him decide to stand up for what he sees needs standing up for. And this in the late 1940s, so it's not as though, and he's writing Jésus Israel. This is apropos of timing once again. He's writing it starting under the occupation, while his family is being murdered, completing it after the war, publishing it, and then going toe-to-toe with Catholic clerics for years on end. And in fact, he's the one, while I'm doing this, who talks to John the 23rd and says, when Vatican II happens, you have to put this on the docket. And the Pope says, you know what, I'm going to do that. And he did it. That's how it got there. So I don't think it liberates a new, I mean, it does, yes, but I think that's not part of my story necessarily.
Okay, I'm noticing, great questions from Richard Weisberg, from Katie Trumpner. I'm going to make sure you see all these questions, but I want to ask, because we're out of time, but I want to ask a last question briefly, like how the book has been received in France, and is it going to be translated into French? That was a question from the audience.
So I hope so. Annette Becker is trying to find a publisher for me. I suspect I've been published before, and so actually that's a plus or minus, right? If I don't sell, no reason to another dud from me. Well, there was more seriousness to the question than
about the reception in France.
Well, it's all been my friends so far, and they like the book. You know what friends are like. I'm hopeful, but I don't know. I don't know just yet how it will be.
Okay, well, we'll see. We can, we'll look forward to hearing about it. But I do encourage everyone to check out the A review, and especially to read the book. It's not only just a fascinating book, but it's actually just a beautifully written book and a really good read. So I recommend it to everyone very highly. So please join me in silently thanking Phil Nord for this really enlightening afternoon presentation. We're really, really grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. I really do. Maury, Carolyn, thank you.
Yeah, and please make sure, if you're not signed up for the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism, that you go to our website and put your name on the list. And then you'll hear about our other great activities. We have a couple more lectures this semester, and we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you all very much.